The deepest cuts leave no physical scars. They are delivered wrapped in a sterile smile and sealed with a whispered, "Thank you." Welcome to the execution room. The victim enters the psychological arena, carrying the heavy burden of an unspoken dread, completely unaware of the silent trap ahead. Observe the predator cloaked in tailored empathy. His breathing accelerates while his posture stiffens, a primal biological response to an invisible threat, lingering coldly in the sterile air. The manipulator does not launch a direct assault. Instead, they weaponize the deafening absolute silence, allowing the fragile mind of the terrified pawn to violently dismantle its own remaining defenses. Uncertainty is the most efficient venom, a simple gesture of manufactured corporate warmth, designed to create a devastating illusion of safety before the fatal psychological strike quietly lands. The victim desperately seeks a stable anchor. They interpret the carefully calibrated superficial calmness as a genuine sign of mutual professional respect, blinding them to the grim, incoming reality. Empathy is merely an instrument of extraction. To amputate a career without shedding blood, the surgeon must first administer the verbal anesthetic, making the patient willingly crave the sharp scalpel. The stage is now perfectly set. The execution begins with a gentle whisper. Fear is a loud heartbeat in a quiet room, echoing the sudden death of absolute certainty before the actual words are even spoken. Look closely at his fearful micro-expressions, the nervous shifting of the heavy eyes, betraying an overwhelming sense of profound powerlessness as the brain anticipates a catastrophic loss. He prepares for a brutal verbal confrontation. The body tightens its invisible biological armor, bracing for the harsh impact of rejection, trying to shield the fragile human ego. But the attack never comes directly out. The architect of this silent psychological demise understands that aggression will only breed resistance, and resistance makes the extraction incredibly messy. A cornered animal will always bite back. Therefore, the predator must eliminate the threat, not by breaking the victim down forcefully, but by letting them collapse under anxiety. The pawn desperately scans for hidden clues. Every prolonged second of this calculated silence stretches the agonizing tension to its limit, turning their own imagination into the enemy. The glass of water remains completely untouched. The pawn is drowning in dry air, suffocating under the weight of the verdict, desperately waiting for the heavy axe to fall. Anxiety is the perfect psychological softening agent. The armor is now completely stripped away. You cannot fight an enemy who claims to be your savior, wrapping your doom in deep compassion. The first verbal strike is paradoxically gentle. The manipulator lowers their vocal pitch, projecting a false sense of profound emotional fatigue, as if this decision hurts them equally. They steal the victim's right to be angry. By mirroring the victim's deep internal exhaustion, they artificially align their emotional states perfectly, preventing any aggressive retaliation from sparking. Empathy becomes the perfect psychological camouflage. The pawn is intensely confused by this warmth, desperately searching for the brutal rejection they had braced themselves to absorb. But there is no visible target to attack. The human ego is designed to fight hostility, but it completely malfunctions against sudden pity, melting down into a state of submission. The manipulator acknowledges the pawn's hard work. This strategic validation creates massive cognitive dissonance, trapping the victim between defensive anger and a desperate craving for approval. Validation is the ultimate psychological trapdoor. When you validate a dying ego, it will happily hand over the knife, trusting the hand that holds it. The trap is now fully locked. The ego surrenders without firing a shot. It is not a humiliating failure. It is merely a tiny cage that can absolutely no longer hold you. Notice the subtle linguistic shift. The master manipulator never uses aggressive words, like termination, firing, or lacking basic skills, to describe this grim professional execution. They reframe the ugly, devastating truth. The victim is not being brutally discarded. They are simply outgrowing a restrictive environment that limits their vast, hidden potential. This is the psychological magic trick. By painting the company as the villain, they shift the perspective of painful rejection from a massive loss to liberation. The pawn's ego absorbs this narrative immediately. It feels incredibly good to finally believe that the corporate system is completely broken, rather than facing personal professional inadequacy. A cage is still a locked prison, but when you paint the iron bars gold, the prisoner will proudly walk right out, feeling completely victorious and entirely free. The manipulator watches the beautiful delusion bloom. They have successfully planted the artificial seed of unearned pride inside the broken mind, watching the toxic flower bloom silently. The brutal rejection has become a blessing. A beautiful lie always beats a cold truth. When the invisible system takes the blame, the fragile human ego rests in absolute peace, never seeking a target for revenge. A master manipulator never absorbs the hatred. They cleverly redirect the victim's burning resentment, pointing the finger at the cold corporate structure, the rigid budgets, or the faceless board. They position themselves alongside the wounded pawn. Using phrases like, "My hands are tied," they successfully construct a brilliant shared illusion, where they are both helpless victims. The executioner transforms into a sympathetic witness. The pawn looks at the man firing him, and instead of seeing a ruthless corporate butcher, they see a tragically constrained ally. This effectively neuters the victim's natural anger. You cannot strike the person holding the gun if you truly believe their reluctant finger is being forced by a ghost. The corporate structure is the perfect scapegoat. It has absolutely no feelings to hurt. It possesses no face to punch in anger, and it leaves no personal scars. The anger dissipates into the sterile air. The pawn completely forgives the smiling architect, tragically redirecting all their burning, useless fury at a building made of glass. The perfect psychological deflection is complete. The butcher washes his hands in silence. The most elegant prison is the one the victim confidently believes they walked out of entirely willingly. The architect now offers a fabricated choice. They present the agonizing departure, not as a forced expulsion, but as a strategic retreat, preserving the victim's sacred professional honor. It is a brilliantly constructed psychological maze. The pawn is gently guided down a narrow corridor of carefully curated options, believing they hold the master key. Every path leads to the exact same exit, but the presentation of autonomy acts as a powerful psychological shield against deep humiliation, allowing the ego to survive intact. The manipulator asks what the pawn wants next. This simple, calculated question forces the broken mind to immediately focus on the future, distracting it from the bleeding present. The illusion of control is deeply intoxicating. When the predator lets the victim dictate minor terms of their own tragic and inevitable execution, the pawn feels like a conquering king. The manipulator simply nods in profound agreement. They validate this fake independence, reinforcing the comforting lie that this painful transition was entirely the victim's brilliant idea. The chains are now forged from pure pride. A willing prisoner never tests the iron gates. A fabricated tomorrow is the perfect psychological anesthetic for the agonizing pain of a bleeding today. Watch the manipulator's eyes shift focus. They stop discussing the painful termination, immediately projecting a grand and entirely fictional vision of the victim's inevitable massive success elsewhere. This is called future pacing. By forcefully dragging the fragile mind forward, they completely bypass the messy emotional grief of the devastating present moment. The predator speaks highly of unseen opportunities. They describe a pristine professional horizon, where the pawn's unique talents are finally recognized, far away from this restrictive corporate cage. The human brain struggles to process loss, but it desperately clings to beautiful possibilities, ignoring the sharp, undeniable reality of the blood currently pooling around its own severed career. The victim begins to actively hallucinate success. You can see the heavy dark shadows literally lifting from their exhausted facial features, replaced by the blinding light of false hope. They are no longer a discarded employee. In their brilliantly manipulated artificial reality, They are a visionary pioneer stepping boldly into a magnificent unknown destiny. The present wound is completely forgotten. Hope is a highly effective executioner. Watch the remaining tension dissolve, not into genuine strength, but into a beautiful and tragic submission. The pawn's entire physical posture dramatically changes. The defensive hunched shoulders completely collapse, replaced by an eerie and unnatural sense of calm sweeping across their tired features. They mistake exhaustion for inner peace. The human brain simply cannot sustain a state of high psychological alert forever. It eventually forcefully powers itself down. The manipulator exploits this exact biological surrender. They offer a final, validating nod, cementing the deep illusion that they have just shared, a profound moment of mutual understanding. But mutual understanding requires equality. There is absolutely no equality here. Only a predator successfully neutralizing its prey, using the gentle weapon of fake compassion. The victim's eyes lose their defensive sharpness. They look deeply into the manipulator's eyes, searching for a final, comforting confirmation that this brutal decision was truly correct. And the manipulator gracefully provides it. A silent exchange of manufactured mutual respect, acting as the psychological burial shroud, covering the corpse of a dead career. The relief is utterly devastating. A peaceful victim never screams. The ultimate psychological theft is complete when the deeply wounded victim literally pays for their own quiet execution. Watch the pawn extend their hand. They reach out across the cold desk, offering a firm and seemingly genuine handshake, completely unaware of the tragic irony. They believe they are showing professional maturity, but in the dark reality of this room, they are simply paying the final psychological tax required to protect their fragile ego. Then comes the most chilling sound. The pawn opens their mouth and whispers a profoundly sincere and heartfelt thank you to the architect of their demise. This gratitude is not genuinely real. It is a massive cognitive defense mechanism, deployed to aggressively convince themselves that they have not been brutally rejected. The manipulator accepts the thanks graciously. They shake the offered hand firmly, cementing the beautiful and devastating lie that this was a mutually beneficial parting. The invisible blood is now washed away. The corporation remains perfectly clean and legally safe, while the pawn walks willingly into the void, carrying the heavy burden of gratitude. The extraction is utterly flawless. A thank you is the cheapest silencer. Empathy was never the primary goal. It was simply the cheapest weapon, forged for a perfectly silent exit. The door clicks shut loudly. Inside the sterile corporate execution chamber, the warm human mask immediately evaporates, revealing the cold calculus underneath. The manipulator did not care about potential. They solely cared about mitigating high risks, ensuring absolutely no lawsuits were filed, and protecting their own fragile ego from conflict. Framing is the ultimate sociopathic tool. It takes the brutal theft of a livelihood and repackages it aggressively as a generous gift of absolute freedom. But a gift cannot pay the rent. Outside the heavy, dark office doors, the powerful psychological anesthetic slowly wears off, leaving the pawn standing in the cold rain. The manufactured pride begins to rot. The terrifying reality of sudden unemployment crashes forcefully through the fragile glass ceiling, shattering the carefully constructed delusion completely. They realize they were not freed. They were brilliantly and quietly discarded, wrapped in a beautiful silken bow, and thanked for bleeding so politely. The silent execution leaves no fingerprints. The ego survives, but the man starves.